Assalamu alaikum. Today we'll be talking about sociolinguistics. This is the lecture 5 of the course English Linguistics English 504. Now, before we go on to the sociolinguistics, look at the slide review of lecture 4. Different branches of language. We talked about different branches of language, and we said that the language deals with the inner mind or the inner world of a person as well as the outer world. And in that we said that the inner world means that the branch of language which deals with the inner world is basically called psycholinguistics. And the branch which deals with the outer world is the sociolinguistics. Now, then we discussed in detail what is psycholinguistics. It is a study of language and brain or the mental processes. Psycholinguistics is basically related to mental phenomena. So mental processes articulated in language behavior. You talk about the mental processes that are portrayed through your language, whatever you say, whatever language you speak, that basically portrays what is happening inside your mind. And it also studies the process of thought, concept formation, and their articulation in language. So whatever the thought process is going on in your mind, or whatever the concepts or the ideas are there in your mind, they come out in the form of language. So this reveals about the structure of human psychology and language. In brief, we would say that psycholinguistics deals with the inner world of a person. Now, then we also give a short definition of sociolinguistics. That was we said that sociolinguistics is basically about the outer world of a person or the language a person speaks in interaction with the society. So it's basically related with society and the human mind, and the society and the language which a person uses in interaction with the society. So language is social, cultural, geographical phenomena, and there's a deep relationship between language and society. Geographical area is considered while studying language. Dialects and the sociolects, they come into play. Now, today let's look at what is basically sociolinguistics in detail. Language to be looked at from within and without. So we have to look at the language, we look at the language from within and without. This means that what type of thought processes are there and what type of language is being used when you are interacting with people outside, when you're living in a certain geographical area, when you're living in a certain locality. Definitely there are changes in language because of the interaction with the people, because of the different languages that you hear. So that is where your language, there are the variations or the changes, they are observed in your language. So language, coming on to the next point, the language to be studied from both the points of view, for form and function. Form means that the inner structure, and the function, the role a language plays in order to satisfy the needs of people. Now, sociolinguistics look at the definition: study of speech functions according to the speaker, the hearer, the relationship and contact, the context and the situation. Now, some words which need focus here are basically the speech functions, the role a speech plays according to the speaker, how a speaker changes language, how a speaker uses language in order to satisfy the desires, in order to get the needs fulfilled, and according to the hearer. Now, what language goes to the hearer, or how the hearer of that language perceives the words, perceives that language, and of course gives a response after that. And then we also study their relationship between the speaker and the listener. How the relationship develops as a result of the language. And the contact, the context. We also study the context. In what context a language has been used. Because a speaker might say something, and sometimes it happens that the listener might perceive it in a different way, or may perceive it in the same way. And how the speaker of that language encodes that language or puts that language in the form which should be understood by the listener. So their context, he has to match the context, he has to match the language and the context, because some of the words he speaks may be out of the context, and then of course there is a chance that he may not get the same response as he expects. So how we also study the context, how the language matches with the context, matches with the situations. The next word is situations. Again, a word very important, because your language may not match the situation. You may have to change the language, you may have to you may have to change the words according to the situations, because the mental filters are different and the listener might perceive it in a different way. So sociolinguistics is all about study of the role of a language in a particular situation, in a particular context, and according to a particular listener, because words, a speaker has to change words sometimes according to all these things. Now, sociolinguistics is also the study of the topic of discourse, the purpose of the discourse, and the form of discourse. So discourse, of course, means a text, a chunk of language, more than a sentence. So it also talks about what type of language it is, what type of text it is, what the text wants to say, what is the objective, or what is the summary, what is the basic content of that discourse, and why a certain language is spoken, or why a certain discourse has been used, and the formation of that discourse, and how that discourse has been used in a certain situation. Now there is also an informal definition of sociolinguistics, who can say what, how, using what means, to whom, and why. Now look at it again. Who can say, the person, the speaker, who can say what, how, right, how he says, what he says, and using what means, what words, what form of language the person uses, and to whom, that is the listener, what he is saying to whom, and what is the purpose, why, what is the purpose of that. So it's all about basically the relationship between the speaker and the listener and the language that comes into play. Sociolinguistics studies the causes and the consequences of the linguistic behavior in human societies. So it also studies the reasons behind a certain language in a certain situation to a certain listener, and the results of that behavior, the linguistic behavior, what comes after that, after certain words have been spoken, after certain language has been used, what is the result of that, what response one expects after that. And all this again is studied in relation to human societies. Different societies have different situations, and different societies have different cultures. So according to those cultures, according to the behavior, according to their social norms and customs, different languages might come into play. So sociolinguistics basically studies also the reasons why certain words have been used, why a certain variety of language has been used, and what is the result of that, what are the responses that people get as a result of using that kind of language. It is also concerned with the function of the language, what role that language plays in certain situations, in certain what role that variety of language plays in a certain situation or in certain contexts. It studies language from without, that is, without the mental processes involved. It studies how the language actually comes into play, how the language comes outside, how what is the form of the language, the cause of that language, variety of language, or the results of that variety of language in a particular situation outside the human mind. So it studies language from without. Now if you look at the broad view, in a broader sense, we can say the study of language as a part of culture and society. Sociolinguistics is basically language as a part of the culture, how it is being used in different cultures, how it is being used in different societies, because you may find so many varieties of language sometimes in one society, and so many varieties also across the societies. You see that the language changes. You might find a different variety of language in a different society. So across the borders, or in the cross-cultural, you might things like cross-cultural communication. That also is an example of how the language sometimes changes when you are communicating across the cultures. There are some other terms which of course come into play, like sociology of language, which can be used for sociolinguistics, like sociology of language, social linguistics, institutional linguistics, anthropological linguistics, linguistics anthropology, ethnolinguistics, ethnography of communication. So all these terms are related somewhat with sociolinguistics. Now, sociolinguistics deals with the exploration of relation between language and society. You deal with what is the relationship of that language with the society, because certain languages, they become associated with certain classes in a society, with certain societies. They become associated, they become related with certain societies. It is based on the fact that language is not a single homogeneous entity. Now, sociolinguistics is based basically on the fact that language is not a single homogeneous entity. You can't take language as a single homogeneous. There are definitely varieties in language. When we say it's not a homogeneous entity, we mean to say that there are different varieties in language. You can't think that language is always the same when you move in different societies. So it has different forms in different situations. Even the situations, even in one society, you find situations. In different situations, you might find different varieties of language. You might find different words, which may differ in grammar, which may differ in pronunciation, which may differ in the way they are spoken. So even in the intonation pattern. So you might find different varieties or different types of these languages, different types of language in different situations. Now, changes in language occur because of changes in social situations. Another important fact here, that language, how language changes, why language changes. It may change because of the changes in social situations. The moment you move into a different situation, you may have to change your language. You may have to use the words, you may have to use the words according to that context, because the context might be different in different social situations. This is very similar. You can take an example of our daily life. Now, once we are at home, we're using a different kinds of language. But once we are in our offices, or once we are in our educational institutions, we have different variety of language. We'll use different, sometimes we use different words, we use different sentences, we use different vocabulary, and all this, it is according to the situations. Now, what are basically the factors? There are different factors which basically make a language change. Let's look at some of the changes, like social class, gender, regional and cultural groups. Some of the changes that you find could be because of the social class difference. The higher class, the middle class, the lower class, you have different kinds of language varieties. Gender, even. With gender, again, you can expect that there are different varieties or different vocabulary being used in genders. Regional, when you go across the region, again, you can expect that the language changes. And cultural groups. again the cultural groups, there are different cultures. Now you can expect this from a different speech community. You can expect this from that particular group, that it uses a particular variety of language, and that is called a speech community, because it has its own separate identity. It has established its own separate identity because of the kind of language it is using. So you call it a speech community. What is a speech community? A particular social group speaking a different variety of a language from the rest of the community. Now, we've seen that language varies, and there are different variations when you move to different cultures, or when you move to different regions. Now, and these regions may be geographical, or even in one region you may have different classes, and when you move from one class to the other, the language may change. Now let's look at some of the varieties of language that we come across. We have RP, which is basically received pronunciation, and this is basically also termed as the Standard English, and you can find it in the southwest of England, and mainly associated with the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, and also the BBC. So when we say BBC English, this is basically RP, the received pronunciation, or the standard, which is termed as the Standard English, which used to be there in the past, but now gradually you have so many other different varieties of language. So this is basically the RP. Usually the universities of Oxford, Cambridge, and the BBC, they use that. Now, then we see that it's a formal kind of English. Going into detail of RP, we see that it's a formal kind of English associated with educated people, and highly educated people, in fact, and English spoken. Then we have another variety, which is English, the variety which is spoken in the north of England. Then we have the English spoken in the Yorkshire and the Lancashire. Then we have the Scottish English, Scottish accent in Scotland. Then we have English, the variety which is spoken in the Wales. It's called Welsh English, with minor variations. You have in some of these varieties, some of the letters are not spoken, some of the letters are not uttered, and some of the sounds are not uttered, and it's a kind of mingled. Some of the sounds are mingled, and some of the sounds are altogether missed out. So the changes are there with minor varieties, minor changes. You have different varieties spoken in the different parts of England. Now, then we have the Cockney English, which is spoken by the working class people, and they are thought to be the less educated people, or the people who don't know the exact, who are not used to speaking the exact using exact pronunciation, or maybe using the correct grammar of English. They are the less educated people, and normally the working class people in England, the kind of language language they speak is termed as Cockney English. Then we have the Indian English, the English which is spoken here. They again here, you know, they have if you look at this kind of English, the English which is being spoken in this kind of this part of the world, there are so many words which have just entered this language from the local language, and they are being used as a part of English. Then we have the Pakistani English, where again you have some of the words of Urdu words, you know, which have entered, or the words which are being used in the Pakistani society are gradually entering English. Then again, there is very less difference between the question form, like when will you come, or when you will come. This is a very common example in Pakistani societies that I've heard, and moreover, then you have, instead of for 10 minutes, from 10 minutes. So the society the people in Pakistan, they have become used to using these terms. So with minor variations in form, or in the structure, or even in the pronunciation of words, you have Pakistani English. Then you have the American English. Again, they have changed their changes in spellings. In American English, you see changes in spellings. They have removed U. They have also stopped. Somewhere you see that instead of C, you see the use of K instead of C for the sound K. So then you have Australian English. Again, it's very spoken very fast, and some of the sounds they are not really clearly identifiable. So you have, with minor variations, you have so many varieties of English. Sociolinguistics. Now, study. So what we conclude here from the variety study of language variation and change, how varieties of language are formed, and when people belong to a how varieties of language are formed when people belong to a geographical region, social class, social situation, and occupation. So we see that language changes can be observed, language variations can be observed when we move from one geographical region to another geographical region, when we move from one social class to another social class, when we move from one social situation to another social situation, or sometimes language also changes with occupations. You have one occupation, a kind of language being spoken in one occupation may not be the same kind of language, may not be the language spoken in some other kind of occupation, because the vocabulary or the jargon, the technical language might differ. We'll talk about this later, some details about the kinds of languages being used in different professions or occupations. Varieties formed in various regions involve change in pronunciation and vocabulary. As we have already discussed this, that pronunciation, there can be minor variation in pronunciation, there can be variation in vocabulary. You can have different pronunciation of words, you can have different vocabulary when the context changes, or when the social situations change, or when the geographical regions change, you may find different vocabulary for the same things. Now, such changes, basically, if you look at the consequences of such changes result in the formation of a distinct, different variety of language or a dialect. Now, here we come across to a different word called dialect. Now, what is a dialect? The changes, the results of the changes, right? As a result of these changes, a separate, distinct variety of language is established. A separate, distinct variety of language comes into the picture, and that is called a dialect. So what is a dialect? Dialect is a variety of language that is a result of changes that might occur when we move to different professions, we move to different social classes, when we move across different social classes, we move across different cultures, we move across different societies. So you find different varieties. So that variety is called basically a dialect. Sometimes changes present within the same geographical region. As we said earlier, that the changes are not only when we move to a different geographical region. Staying within the same geographical region, we can find changes because of different social classes or social groups. Sometimes changes present within the same geographical region due to social differences, different social classes. Between different economic sections, even the working class aristocracy or high class, low class, middle class, low class, again the changes are there. Now these changes may be because of economic conditions, because they have their particular vocabulary, they are not exposed to the high class situations, they are not exposed to that culture, so they have their own vocabulary, they are not exposed to the language which is being used in a different class. So this again, the dialects or the different varieties of language being used, being created because of a class difference, can be termed as class dialect. So class dialect, we come to a different word now. Class dialect. What is a class dialect? It's basically a dialect which is formed because of the difference in classes, the economic classes. Now, moving on, you can see the examples. Syntax, you see that syntax variation. I've gotten it, I ain't seen nothing. Now, again, you see this is the difference in grammar, the syntax. the way the words have been put in different places in a sentence. I've gotten it, or I ain't see nothing. Now here you see the use of double negative. I haven't seen nothing. This means you've seen something, but it's very common sentence. Usually you see in the, when we're watching movies, even in the American movies, you hear I ain't done nothing. Like, I haven't done nothing. This means you did something, but they don't go to the underlying meaning. It's spoken in, you can say it's spoken in a less educated or a slang. I would say also can be termed as a slang. It's a syntax variation. You vary the places where you use certain words in a sentence, and that this kind of variation, you can put it in the under the syntax variation. Lexical variation, again you see lexical variations like lift in British English and elevator in American English. Now the thing is the same, but you have entirely different words. Lift for British English and elevator for American English. Another example can be flat and apartment. So in one you have the lexical variations, the words are different. Same way you can also find that there can be the places of where the words, the syntax variation or the place of different words in a sentence can be different, and that of course with these variations you can a separate variety of language is created. Dialectology, another term, study of the demarcation of dialect boundaries across a region and of specific features of each dialogue. Now, what is dialectology? When you demarcate, when you create boundaries, when you establish boundaries of between dialects, when one dialect changes the boundary between one dialect and the other dialect, where moving in geographical regions, there is a place where you start finding the words, or you start finding the vocabulary of a different kind. Now that is where you say that it's demarcated, and the words, now we have entered a different speech community, or we have entered a different kind of variety or different kind of language. We start hearing different words. We start hearing different syntactic structures. So dialectology is basically the study of the demarcation of dialect boundaries across a region and of specific features of the dialogue. So you study how the dialect has changed, how the variety of English has changed when we moved from one particular geographical region to another geographical region, or one class to another class, or one region to another region. And we also study the specific features of that dialect, what different words and what different sentences we can hear in that different variety of English. That is what is called dialectology. Now, demarcation of dialects is done by, how do we demarcate? The question arises, how do we demarcate? How do we distinguish between one dialect and the other dialect? It's done by listing the features of that particular region. We enlist, or we look at the different features of that. We may look at the professions of the dominant profession in that very region. We may look at the dominant class or economic class of that region. So when we list the features, the different characteristics of that particular region, we might find the reason or the cause behind establishing a different variety of English, or we might find the reason behind the change in the vocabulary, or the change in the form of English and we may find the reason behind this linguistic change. So by demarcating dialects, we mean that we are basically trying to find that boundary, trying to find the reason for that boundary also, and trying to find that boundary where one variety changes to another variety, and you find a different variety of English. Now, what is isogloss or dialect boundary? The point at which a certain feature, it may be pronunciation, it may be vocabulary, ceases to be prevalent and gives way to another feature. So that very boundary from where one particular kind of one particular variety of language ceases, finishes, and another variety starts, that boundary is termed as dialect boundary. Now, it may not be a very hard and fast rule that this is the place, exact place where the one kind of vocabulary is not is finished and you can't find the words in of the last region. It sometimes becomes difficult to distinguish, sometimes becomes difficult to demarcate, because the people are moving and people are living in between the two. They are moving from one culture to another culture, so some of the words, it becomes blurred. The boundaries, they become blurred because of the movement, because of the education even. Like in the case of Cockney. Now, Cockney school is gradually finishing because Cockney school is gradually diminishing. You find that the Cockney variety of English is, you can't find it very common now because of education. People are getting educated and they are also moving from one class to another class. So gradually that variety is gradually, that variety you can find it's very little now, and very few people speak it. You may find that the Cockney variety of English is no longer now in some of the classes, some of the working class people even. Now, dialects may enjoy prestige and evolve into distinct language. Sometimes it happens that dialects, they are so strong and they enjoy so strong status that they start enjoying prestige or respect. Now, in case of prestige and respect, a dialect also becomes a language. It evolves into a distinct language, and it establishes its identity. And especially when you find the writings in that, in the writings or in the papers or in the research, you start finding those words, or start even in the educated class, you find people using that kind of dialect. Now, then it starts enjoying a prestige, it starts enjoying a respect, and that is where it attains the status of a language. So it may stain, a dialect may even attain the place of a place of a language. Now, this happens, they are codified. When this happens, when a dialect may attain the status of a language, then of course certain codes they come into origin, and the languages or the dialects, they are codified. That is, in literary forms, in grammar and lexicon are standardized. The literary forms are created and the grammar comes into play. There's a particular grammar that is used to in those the grammatical rules, they come into origin, and the lexicons, the sentences used in that dialect are standardized, and they are given a respect and prestige. Now, it happens when a dialect is given political and social importance. Now, this happens usually when politically, in the political circles or in the social circles, that dialect is given importance, and a lot of people, they start using those sentences or those that vocabulary. So that is when it attains a place of respect. So when it attains a place of respect, it may enter the domain of language. It may become a special language. Now, another reason for variation in language may be that the language is used, different language is used in different specific areas of human activity. Like, you have different variety of English being used in the domain of law, in religion, science, sports, business. Now, you have specific vocabulary, specific jargon, or technical words, technical language being used in law, in religion, in social, in sciences, in sports, in business. Now, depending on the kind of profession you have you have some special words or some technical words which are only understood by the people of that very profession. They may not be understood by the people of another profession. So this is jargon, and we can put examples as law jargon, as religion jargon, or jargon of science, or jargon of sports, jargon of business. So depending on the kinds of professions or the human or the different areas of human activity, you may find again different varieties of language. So this could be this is another reason for variation, that when you move from one profession to another profession, the vocabulary is different because of the equipment sometimes that is being used. Like the equipment being used in the medical sciences is of course different from the equipment being used by a sportsman. Likewise, the equipment being used by an engineer might be different from an equipment being used by a chemist. So because of that very equipment, because of the vocabulary, there we find different words, different technical words, and different terminology and different usage of those terms. You can find that a different variety. You'll find different varieties of language. Likewise, in case of a very common example of a bear and a bull. Here I would like to give related with this, that a bear for a stock exchange person means something else, but a bear means something else to a camper in a forest. Likewise, bull is different for a stock exchange person, and bull is different for a person camping in the forest. You have another word, credit. Now, credit is different for a banker, and credit again is different for a person in a university, for a university registrar. So you have, sometimes you have the same words meaning different, so depending on the context. Here the words are the same, but the context changes and they are taken in a different context. And sometimes you have different vocabulary, that is entirely a different word is used for the same thing. So some words which are understood as one thing in one profession may mean something else in a different profession. So you have people have developed a specific vocabulary or specific kinds of words for different professions, and that is a reason that different varieties of language, depending on the area of human activity that have come into origin. Now, every field, as you can see, every field has specific vocabulary and the manner of use. Now, what is this basically called? It's called a register. Now, register means the specific vocabulary and the manner of use, the way that vocabulary is used, the way it is used in different situations or in different professions, that is called a register. Now, let's talk a little about registers. What are registers basically? Sociolinguistics examine. We'll talk about registers again in detail in our next lecture, but just putting some more light on this word sociolinguistics, because it's very important, and because they are related with professions, and professions of course are very important aspect of human activity, so definitely they need more focus. Sociolinguistics examines the particular characteristics of different registers. In sociolinguistics, we also study the particular characteristics, the particular features of different registers. For example, legal registers, you have scientific registers, now you have business registers. So the way, as we said earlier, that you can call them the jargon of business, the jargon of science, the jargon of law. We can also call them legal registers, scientific registers, and when we go into the study of these registers, we come to know the features, the reasons, the results of using these registers. Sociolinguists see how they differ to enable us to understand how language use is tied to a social context. So, as I said earlier, that when we go into the study of these registers, we come to know how the language use is related to some social context. In different contexts, you have the same, in one profession the context may vary, and in different contexts different words are used. And also when we move to another profession, you have a different kind of vocabulary. As I gave you example about credit, I gave you example about bear and bull. So you move to another profession, sometimes the same words may mean different, or sometimes you have different, entirely different words for the same thing. So these words, the particular vocabulary that is used in one profession, that is tied to social context, that is related with the social context. As the context changes, the vocabulary changes. The context changes, the language, the pronunciation may change even. The grammar changes, the vocabulary changes, the syntax changes sometimes. So, and that becomes associated with that very class or that very context. Now, moving on, we see, let's look at the utility, the significance of these registers. The notion of register is important. It shows that language use in communication is not arbitrary or uncontrolled, but governed by rules of situational and contextual appropriateness. Some words which need attention here are: the language used in communication is not arbitrary. It's not arbitrary means that it's not uncontrolled. You have a particular control in social situations. You change your words, you change your vocabulary. It's not arbitrary, it's basically controlled. It's not that unintentionally you are using that, but you control your words, you control your vocabulary when you move to from one social situation or one class to another class or one profession to another profession. It is governed by rules of situation. The rules of situation. As a situation changes, your language changes. There are particular rules. There's a certain kind of vocabulary that is used in a different class, in a particular class, and those rules, they basically govern your change, govern your language. They control your language, and sometimes the context changes. Living in the same class, living in the same situation, sometimes different contexts are used, and in those different contexts there are rules of that change, and those rules, they control your vocabulary. And again here it depends on the skill of the speaker, how clever a speaker is to implement that change or to match the context, his own context and the context of the listener, because the two contexts have to be matched in order to get a desired response from the listener. If you keep on using the same vocabulary, keep on using the same variety of language, when you move to another class or when you move to another section of the society, that is where there is a danger that you may not be able to convey your meaning to a person of a different class or a different society. So basically, even before that, you have to study the variety. You have to know the meanings or the rudimentary vocabulary or the rudimentary rudiments of that language. You must have the basic knowledge of that of that very class or the language spoken in that very class, so that you don't face difficulty in interaction with the people of different society, different class. So it is here that you have to be aware of the rules. You have to be aware of the different situations, the changing situations, and that is where you will get a help to change, to implement those changes, or to use a different kind of language, or to adopt a different vocabulary of different vocabulary, different syntax, or a different variety of language when you move to another class, or when you move to another class of society, or when you move to another geographical region. So the use of register here, the use of register is very important. If you are aware of the vocabulary of that profession, of a different profession, again, that can help you to implement that change, or to change your variety according to the changing situation. Now, some of the terms which are sometimes confused with sociolinguistics are sociology. Are, for example, we can use the term sociology of language. Now, what is basically sociology of language? That includes the study of attitudes to language by social groups. Different social groups, they give importance to languages, and they decide which languages are more important and which languages are less important. Which languages are more important to give them the status of being the medium of instruction, or the medium of or which languages are not important or less important as to be the second language in that country. Here we have the example of the language policies. The language policies, in language policies, they decide which language should be used as the official language, which language should be used as the language of instruction or medium of instruction. Like in Pakistan, there is the controversy. There has been a controversy, the English Urdu controversy, and they have been experimenting on English and Urdu, on introducing English from class 1 and then again introducing English from class 5. So this controversy has really has given us two different pictures, where sometimes we think that English is more important and sometimes we are giving importance to Urdu language. So in the sociology of language, we basically study the language use also, how important is that language in that very society, how much it is used, how less it is used, and then we give importance. We relate the importance, relate that language with official language. We make that language as an official language or the medium of instruction sometimes, and sometimes we just leave it as a second language or the third language even. So this is basically a different kind of study, whereas social linguistics again is a different kind of study. Now, in the next bullet we see that in sociology of language we talk about what are the legal languages and what are the languages which are given legal importance and the constitution importance. So such languages, they enjoy high prestige or high importance, which are they enjoy the high status, and from that status we determine or we make rules that these languages are to be used as the medium of instruction or the medium of or the official languages of the state. Now, sociology of language is also related to other aspects of the social world: political, economical, social. Now, what is sociology of language? Again, we see the relationship of sociology of language with some other aspects of the social world, like the political. Which language is used in political circles? Which language is the political language? Or which language is used in the economic circles? You have different languages used in the banks, or different varieties of language used in the banks or the financial institutions. Again, you have different different varieties of language being used in the high class, middle class, low class, and also the social. In different sections of the society, in different areas of society, you have different kinds of languages being used. So it also is related with the with these aspects. The sociology of language is also related with these different aspects, like social world, like the political world, or the economic world. Now, what did we look at? This is basically what we have here for this lecture, and let's look at what we did today and what we talked about today. We basically started with the social linguistics, the definition of social linguistics. What is social linguistics? What does it study? And we saw that it talks about the causes and the results of linguistic behavior in human societies, and language changes as we move from one section of society to the other section of the society. Some other terms like sociology of language, social linguistics, we saw some terms. Then social linguistics also deals with the exploration of relation between language and society and language, and we saw that language is not a single homogeneous entity. The varieties change. You find different vocabulary, different lexicon, different pronunciation across the regions. Could be geographical regions, or could be the different sections in the same society. Then we looked at two terms, speech community, and then the class. We have social class, gender. We saw the changes like social class, gender, regional and cultural groups. They have different varieties of language. We also looked at different varieties of language, like the received pronunciation, like the English spoken in the north of England, in Yorkshire, in Lancashire, in then we had Scottish English, we had Welsh English, we had Cockney English being spoken by the working class of England, who are considered the less educated people. Then we looked at different causes. Variation in change, such changes result in different what these different varieties can be called. We saw the word dialect. What is the class dialect? That the economic sections, different economic sections have a different variety of English, and these varieties we can term them as class dialects. Then we saw the examples. Syntax examples, a change in syntax, a change in lexicon, like the lift and elevator. You have flat and apartment. We looked at dialectology. What is dialectology? It's a demarcation, the boundary where one variety ceases to exist, and then you can find a different variety related to a different region. We looked at isoclass. What is isoclass? A dialect boundary, a boundary from where you start looking, you start finding to hear different words or different variety of English in use. Then we looked at the change of language according to the professions, and that was called register. So what are register? The sociolinguistics. What is the importance of registers? We saw some examples of registers, like the legal register, the scientific register. The sociolinguists also saw, they also see that how these differences they help us to study the specific features of those languages being used in different professions. The use of that moving on towards the conclusion or the summary of this lecture, we see that the utility, what is the use of this, that they help us in controlling the language, and we see that the change we implement in our language when we move from one class to another, or from one profession to another profession, that change is controlled and it's governed by certain laws, and these laws are the situational laws or the contextual. These laws are according to the situation and according to the context. The situation changes, the profession changes, you move from one profession to another profession, the situation changes, the laws change, and these laws basically they help us to control our language. Then we saw some terms like sociology of language. There is, summing up today's lecture, we see that some of the terms are again confused with sociolinguistics, whereas they mean something else. We saw sociology of language. It also includes study of attitudes to language by social groups, like which language is more important, which less important. They grade the languages, they give importance to the languages, and they decide, basically linguists, they study these languages, these different varieties of languages, and they basically decide which language is to be given more importance, as to make it as an official language or to make it as a language of instruction, and which language is less important, as to leave it as a second language, and which they also look at which languages should be given the legal importance and which languages should be they enjoy the constitutional importance, or they are constitutionally recognized, and they basically decide about the status of language. And again, we saw that sociology of language is related to other aspects of social world, like the political, like economical, social, and we study about the different languages, different varieties of language being used in the political circles and economic circles and social circles. So this was something about sociology. This is basically one part of the sociolinguistics. We have another part in which we will study the different changes, the language variation, how language varies, and what different varieties we can find, what different like we'll have details of registers, we'll have other terms which are are used in the change or the language variation. So that will be our next lecture. Till then, it's Khuda Hafiz, and this is what we had in our lecture 5. Thank you.